Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. And thank you for attending the third and last day of our annual workshop on survey methodology. I am Alexandre Barbosa from the Regional Center for Development, for Studies on the Development of the Information Society, Cetic.br, at the Brazilian Network Information Center. This event, as you probably know, is jointly organized by Cetic and the National School of Statistical Science linked to the Brazilian NSO, the Brazilian Institute for Geography and Statistics, IBGE. And for those who were not able to join us yesterday, I just wanted to mention that we had a very interesting session on big data in official statistics, and we had the chance to discuss new methods based on alternative data sources and on how to meet quality standards from these alternative data sources. We also discussed the use of machine learning as statistical methods. And for today's webinar, we have 4 key international organizations that will showcase their initiatives and projects on AI and the importance of measurement, and of course, the importance of proper indicators and statistics to measure the adoption of artificial intelligence and its potential impacts in society, in business, government, etc. We will see the enormous potential of AI for enabling socioeconomic development and how AI can be an effective instrument for achieving the UN Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs, as well as in how AI can help business to improve their efficiency or to change their process. So this is our workshop today. So without further ado, I would like to ask Tatiana Gereissat, who will introduce our guest speakers and moderate today's webinar. So Tatiana, please, you have the floor, and I wish all of you a very productive and interactive webinar. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Hello to all, and welcome to the third day and final day of the NIC.br workshop on survey methodology. This year, this annual event hosted by NIC.br is being conducted entirely online, as you are well aware, but we are hopeful that in the upcoming year, we will be able to return to the traditional face-to-face format. So as we have discussed in days 1 and 2 of the workshop, data collection activities have been greatly impacted by the pandemic. Data producers are under pressing demands for relevant, timely, robust, and reliable data. And they have also been facing challenges to meet users' needs. We have been discussing some of these challenges in the past few days. So in face of this complex scenario, this workshop edition addressed the theme Innovation and Trends on ICT Data Production. The pandemic has also highlighted the vital role of technologies to connect people and also to enable the continuity of education, public services, commerce, among many others. In particular, as developments in artificial intelligence advances, a lot has been discussed about what its possible contributions are, but also regarding the new challenges posed to society. So today we have different organizations that are invited to showcase their projects related to the development, adoption, and implications of AI in different fields of work. So before we start our session, I would like to announce a few notices on the event today. Our webinar today will run from 10 a.m. to 12:30 and will be composed by 2 sessions and 4 presentations. In each session, we will have 2 presentations of 25 minutes each, followed by a question and answer session of 15 minutes. And we will also have a 5-minute comfort break between sessions 1 and 2. So please note that simultaneous translation is available for Portuguese and English, and feel free to select the preferred language in the globe icon. Kindly check your microphone is on mute, and please do be encouraged to use the chat for raising questions or sending comments to the speakers. Finally, please note that this webinar is being recorded and will be made available on NIC.br's YouTube channel. So to begin our session today, I'm pleased to invite my colleagues from Unesco to join us. Cedric Wacholz is the head of Unesco's Digital Innovation and Transformation sector, which includes multiple AI work streams. He will share his presentation with Pratik Sibal, a program specialist, also with the CI/DIT section. UNESCO has been conducting important work on the ethical and human dimensions of AI. So I would like to begin by asking Cedric how UNESCO is addressing AI through its work, and which are the key areas of concern. Cedric, Pratik, you have the floor for 25 minutes.
Thank you so much, Alexandre and Tatiana, for these introductory words. We can't wait to come back to Sao Paulo in person. And I remember very well the extraordinary regional AI conference Cetic organized just before the COVID pandemic broke out. And let me really start by paying tribute to Cedric's outstanding work and Alexandre's lead and our close cooperation. And thank you for this invitation to the workshop. I wish to first introduce also my dear colleague Pratik, who works in our digital innovation and transformation work, the team on working on AI. And we will be, as you just said, Tatiana, jointly presenting. The ongoing pandemic has indeed cast spotlight on how digitalization is crucial to improving our capabilities to deal with crisis. There's an urgent need for all stakeholders in our societies to tap into the potential and at the same time mitigate the risks that come with digital transformation. In particular, policymakers, business leaders, statisticians, civil society advocates, and academics across the world have been paying great attention to the development in the field of AI, and of course, also to data. In our presentation today, we will look at, in particular, at AI challenges and share with you how we operate and what we do in this field. Overall, UNESCO contributes with our AI work to the achievement of the UN's SDGs, especially the SDGs you see here, the SDG 4, 5, 8, 13, 16, and 17A particularly. And UNESCO, we also in particular look at societal implications of AI within our mandate and across our two global priorities, which is gender equality and also Africa. Now, some of you will know also that we have different sectors. We have 5 different sectors in UNESCO, and we are doing different work in these domains. We have an intersectoral AI team, which is led by 2 assistant director generals. But the most important thing is there are 5 different topics, and about 62 people are working on AI across the organization. And I'm one of the co-lead facilitators of this team. Social sciences, to make it short, works on standard setting and particularly on the AI ethics recommendation and particularly also on social implications of AI. The CI sector, the communication and information sector, looks particularly at human rights, at the impact on freedom of expression, privacy, the safety of journalists too, but also on AI policy making, on capacity development and digital competencies in this field. We have a strong education sector, which has been publishing a lot on AI for teaching and learning, on educational management and information systems and how AI can improve them, and how to prepare for the future of learning and work. The natural sciences sector looks particularly at the disaster risk reduction dimensions, at climate science and culture based on the 2005 convention, which has a strong digital component, looks also particularly at cultural diversity and the impact of AI in this field. Now, how do we operate? We have 5 different ways of functioning. We look particularly in enhancing research and advocacy, at standard setting, at policy advice, and also at capacity development and international cooperation. Our underlying value is based on the decision of our member states, and our approach is the Rome X approach. Some of you might heard about it, but of course we have first of all a human rights-based approach, we look at the multi-stakeholder. At openness first. We do have we make sure that, in openness, we work, for example, on free and open source software, on open access to scientific information, but also open educational resources. But also our approach is and one of accessibility and of multi-stakeholder participation. And the X stands for gender equality and other cross-cutting priorities. So that is how our member states would like us to work on the internet, but also in the domain of artificial intelligence. And some of you, and I go now to some of the challenges we face. We know that AI has a lot of implications on our everyday life. But of course, there are questions relating to human rights and the underlying values and principle of the work in this technology field. And UNESCO is currently and has developed the first global standard setting instrument over the last 3 years. And we hope it will be adopted in November of this year at the 41st General Conference. And 193 member states have negotiated over 100 hours on a text, and it is the first. It is about, of course, agreeing on the values and principles and also policy areas for action here. And the recommendation covers many different areas. It speaks about privacy, biases and discrimination, about accountability and human control, about explainability and transparency. And of course, we can't cover in depth all these dimensions now. But some of you might wonder, how do we get to such a draft? And it is actually, I mentioned, a 3 years process, where we have first a group of experts coming together, doing a pre-paper. Then the General Conference decided to go ahead. And then with experts from all the regions, the first draft was developed, and then multi-stakeholder consultation, very comprehensive consultations took place all over the world. Another draft was published, and then it became an intergovernmental process. Now, on the 11 areas which are covered, I mentioned a few domains, but a recommendation recommends also concrete actions in different fields. And these are about ethical and human rights-based impact assessments. Our governments want us to work on this domain. And all of you will be particularly interested in the data policy dimension of this draft. And there's, of course, gender, environment, ecosystem policies, education, labor, communication and information, and health is also covered. Let me move on in view of time. Now I want to go into another domain. This first work I presented was about standard setting. Now I want to speak about capacity development and about UNESCO's Global Judges Initiative, where UNESCO has already trained over 23,000 judicial operators in 150 countries on issues related to freedom of expression, access to information, and safety of journalists. And based on the findings of an AI needs survey we will briefly mention later, but also another survey with responses of over 1,200 judicial operators in 100 countries, this course was conceived. And I would like to highlight and thank also Cetic and NIC.br, who have contributed also to this work and to this joint work. And you can see that the registration for this course will open in November 2021. And with respect to the summer break in Latin America, we will start the course, the training a little bit later in March. but it will be first about how can judiciaries use AI in their administrative work to strengthen access to justice and improve internal processes. And secondly, also, what are the real uses of AI and the specific legal challenges, such as biases, discrimination, it poses. So I hand now over to Pratik on our work on AI policy protocols, please.
Thanks, Cedric. Just wanted to share that the screen is a bit smaller if it's in portrait mode. If there's something at your end that you can do so that it becomes bigger, but just
I will try that.
Yeah, if that's possible. We didn't want to interrupt you in between. Okay.
Oh, sure.
Thanks, everyone, for the opportunity to present. So I'll be speaking a little bit more about some of the policy work that we are doing. As you've noticed in what Cedric presented, so we started with standard setting work, which is around the recommendation on ethics of AI. But the real question now emerges, how do we translate these standards and principles into real action? And what is that real action? So when we talk about real change that we want to see, one of the steps we foresee is in terms of support for developing policies. Now, in some of the scoping work that we did, there are several challenges that emerge in policymaking. And I'll probably kind of scope out a bit and talk about something called the Collingridge dilemma. So the Collingridge dilemma is specific to technologies and its impact on society, and it came from around 1980s with an American STS scholar, David Collingridge, who coined the term. When a new technology is introduced, we do not fully understand the impact of the technology on society. So when we talk about regulating or creating policies, we just don't have enough information. And a lot of times then this decision making in this kind of process is called decision making under ignorance. Whereas if we do not regulate or if we do not take any action in terms of policies, it may lead us to a state where it's too late because the technology is so deeply entrenched in society that it's difficult to reverse its impact, especially what we've seen with social media. We started seeing perhaps even in early 2010s, some of the impact of filter bubbles and echo chambers and these kind of the vocabulary started to be developed. And in 2016s, we started to see real explosion of the impact of these technologies on society with genocide being perpetrated, with social media being used as an amplifier and so on. So this to me is a real example of what we call the Collingridge dilemma, which makes for policymakers to regulate technology's impact on society specifically tricky. So what are the solutions? I don't have any fixed answers, but Collingridge kind of developed a guideline where he said, you can have first work with technologies where the cost of reversing the impact is low. We should have constant monitoring of the technology so that we can constantly understand. And perhaps there are even opportunities here to use AI systems to monitor the impact of technology on society. And this very well relates with the work which Cetic does on statistics and measurement, for instance. I for one know that there is some bit of work going on in academic circles on smart policy making. And what does that mean? So there are different ways of ensuring that we can go around this Collingridge dilemma. So specifically what we at Unesco are doing, so maybe okay, Cedric is sharing the presentation then. So we started first with supporting the development of policies in a multi-stakeholder manner. We've seen that a lot of times policy processes can be exclusionary. They can be a group of people developing policies which end up not serving all, which is the first step to us to make the process multi-stakeholder. So we've launched a series of workshops over the month of September and October, where we asked experts from around the world on what do they think are processes that make policy making inclusive. People came up with a wide variety of answers on how to strengthen youth engagement. One of the challenge in terms of AI policy that we saw was about situational awareness. In a lot of countries, when you go and develop a policy, that awareness to contribute is not present. So how do we raise situational awareness around AI policy making? So that was one of the challenges. We are collecting use cases from around the world, including from Brazil. We had a consultation with representatives from the ministries in Brazil, which would be feeding into a white paper on which will be a protocol on how to make AI policies inclusive, which will be launched at the Internet Governance Forum in 2021. Perhaps we can move to the next slide, Cedric.
Cedric, we can't see the slide that is being shared. Perhaps.
Oh.
Perhaps you can try again.
Okay. Apologies.
Or we can also do that from here if you prefer, because we have the presentation back up.
Yes, I will give it another try. Otherwise, we'll do it from there.
And in the meantime, since this is supposed to be a participatory process, so people who are participating in this session, please feel free to send your questions or thoughts on this topic of making policy making inclusive, and what are your experiences in this. We would take that from the chat and also try to reflect it in the white paper that we are sharing, that we are developing, and we'll also share it with Cetic colleagues if they would like to share it widely for wider input. Thanks, Cedric. I think we missed a couple of slides. Maybe we go back a bit. Yeah. Okay. So then this is what I talked about was broadly about AI policies. Now, we at UNESCO are also focusing specifically on certain fields. For instance, education is a big part of UNESCO's mandate. And AI is being used for teaching and learning systems, to grade assignments, to basically a lot of times free up time for teachers to facilitate learning as well. So this is part of the work that UNESCO is doing, and UNESCO's education sector has developed this guidance for policymakers, which has, again, part of the work that we do is identifying use cases and best practice from around the world and sharing them widely so that we have good practices and exchange of ideas. We can go on to the next one. This is an interesting work that we did in terms of engaging young people. We've worked quite extensively on human rights, especially from a freedom of expression, privacy, bias and discrimination angle. And we developed case studies, and we also looked at basically echo chambers, filter bubbles, and how they're impacting our interactions online. What are the real world impacts of those? And we developed this micro-learning tool with Unitar, which is available now in English, French, Spanish, and Russian for everyone to access. I would invite you to take this course if you would like. And this is also going to talk about some of the data aspects on what are the entry points for biases, whether it's programmer-driven biases, which can be in terms of how they select different features of the data or what kind of algorithm they are choosing, or it is data-driven biases, which can be in the form of underrepresentation in data, or totally sometimes data sets don't exist for certain populations, or there can be proxy-induced biases. So we talk about a whole bunch of issues with respect to data and biases in this, which may be quite interesting to the participants today as well. And we will transition to the next one. Well, continuing on the work on engaging young people, we also this was really our colleague Sasha Rubel, who was working with us before, whose brainchild this product was, which is a graphic novel on AI, and it's we've created a parallel universe in this, which reaches out to young people to kind of break down AI in a way that is more accessible. And this is part of the work which we are trying to do on increasing situational awareness, because unless people are aware about what is happening in this domain, they cannot contribute. So as the first step in translating principles to action, a good part of our work focuses on raising awareness of different audiences. And this publication would also be launched in 2022. We've also, gender equality is a priority for UNESCO, and we've been working with the OECD, IATB, and the Oxford Internet Institute to actually develop a publication which talks about the effects of women in the AI workforce, the effect of AI on women in the workforce. So we've seen that women are underrepresented. Only 22% of the AI workforce is women, and within the AI work cycle also there are challenges. There's generally this kind of bro culture, or there are other challenges. So this is kind of an evidence-based research that we are working on, which will also be launched later next year. This is a publication that we did kind of framing the Rome approach that UNESCO has, the rights, openness, access, and multi-stakeholder framework, and apply it to AI. And I know colleagues from Cetic have been quite closely involved in this work with the internet universality and measurement. And now slowly we would also be working towards measurements related to AI. I think in view of the time, I need to move fast. I see from Cedric's transition of slides.
I tried to accelerate a bit. You know, we are coming close to our time.
I think a part of the work that we did recently in Africa was measuring the needs, the policy priorities and capacity building needs. And this could be quite interesting for colleagues in Latin America as well. There's a big gap in terms of knowledge and information on AI policies development in the global South. And this publication bridges that divide, and following which we have several products that we've developed, including the AI and the rule of law related work. And also to identify what are the blind spots in AI policy, we are working on a research, kind of an academic journal with the Quebec Institute on Artificial Intelligence. I think it will be over to Cedric now.
Okay, well, sorry to hasten you a little bit, but as time is running, I accelerated. And here I wanted to share with you a new product launched just in September of this year, which is a neutral, authoritative, one-stop platform. And I don't know if Davo might speak about it later, but this is a place where citizens, stakeholders, policymakers can access up-to-date knowledge on AI from all the different organizations you see here. And the aim is, of course, to help navigating the international AI governance landscape. And you can see our key partners here, and I really recommend, and it is building up, of course. In terms of policy advice, we have mentioned already the AI Judges Initiative. Here is another, the Athens Roundtable, as an annual conference seeking to advance the development of policies and educational initiatives and evidence-based instruments in this domain too. I rapidly want to mention also that we have been doing with UNEP a series on AI for the planet. As all of you know, humanity has 10 years remaining to solve the climate change and biodiversity loss and the pollution, and AI both can address some of the challenges, but also contributes to that problem. And we had monthly events on that. And as another way of internationally cooperating, there's the Open for Good Alliance. And Pratik, would you like to comment, please?
Sure. I think we're totally over time, but so part of the Open for Good Alliance is this work that we co-founded with GIZ and colleagues from around the world, where we want to strengthen access to data sets in different countries. There's a big gap in, for instance, language data sets. And I think my colleague Davor, who would be speaking next, would also talk a little bit more about this. But at UNESCO, we try to fund a project around creation of data sets in low resource languages with IRCAI and Knowledge for All Foundation, where this work has supported in 9 languages across 22 countries data set development, which would then strengthen access to information. For instance, if you want a website or a translation engine to be developed in these languages, which can then translate a website into these languages, you need that data first. And because that data doesn't exist, a lot of the potential to participate in the digital economy is lost out for a lot of communities around the world. So this is one of the objective of this work. But at this point, I would also take the opportunity to actually invite Cetic to join this Open for Good Alliance, given the work that you're doing on data, and we can definitely be in touch with you on how to take it forward. Yeah.
I didn't want to shorten that because I think the audience would really love that. Just to sum up and wrap up what we tried to do in our presentation today was to briefly tell you about our goals, how we operate, a number of challenges we tried to address through our standard setting work, through our capacity and policy development work, and also through our international cooperation. And AI is, of course, developing rapidly, and it is important for all of us to get an overview of AI development, which have both potentially adverse impacts and can also, of course, enhance our work in the different domains. I will close now with that and hand over back to you, Tatiana. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Cedric and Pratik, for an excellent presentation on.
Muitíssimo obrigado, Cedric and Pratik, for the excellent.
So many different areas. This has been very interesting indeed. And let me mention that all participants are welcome to share their questions through the chat. So please remember to state who your question is for. And we will now move on to our second presentation. And after the second presentation, both speakers from the first presentation will be invited to address all of the questions. So we would now like to welcome our colleagues from the International Artificial Intelligence Research Center, IRCAI, which is a UNESCO Category 2 center based in Slovenia. So although IRCAI was established very recently in 2020, it has been conducting an impressive amount of work on many different fields related to the intersection of AI and the SDGs. So today we will hear from our colleagues David Orlich at IRCAI, who is Chief Operating Officer, and his colleagues Matej Pozinkovic and Matej Kovacic. David, Matej, and Matej, it is a pleasure to have you with us today. So I would like to start by asking you, how can AI be used as an accelerator to the UN's SDGs? You have the floor for 25 minutes.
Should I start, right? Tatiana?
Perfect. Go ahead.
Thank you. Let's answer this question once we go through our presentation, because we have basically two of them. To answer Pratik's and Cedric's hint at what should I show or what would I have to show, I'm not going to. We have other stuff to show. So there you have it. So we have been doing work, as you mentioned, Cedric, on the Global Policy AI software, should I say, or dashboard. We've been doing work with the Open for Good Alliance, but today we wanted to show two very specific hands-on applications that the center has been developing, basically with our colleagues at the Josef Stefan Institute. Just a brief word about IRCAI. So IRCAI is essentially a UNESCO Category 2 center, equally as our hosts Cetic.br. So we're trying to push this partnership forward. This is why this workshop is also happening. The idea of IRCAI is quite simple. It sits in between UNESCO, the government of Slovenia, and the Josef Stefan Institute. So at the moment, we're basically a department at the institute and looking into becoming an independent legal entity in the next year or so. So within that constellation, it's fair to say that you cannot have one center to rule them all. it doesn't work like that. You have to actually work with everyone because different people have different skills and capacities. For example, we are trying to understand how to use AI for sustainable development, but as you can imagine, if you have a climate change challenge in sub-Saharan Africa, there's a group of researchers that are solving a localized problem with AI methods, whereas climate change in, should I say, Norway or Sweden would require a different set of skills and competencies within the same branch of AI or development. So it's very important to have this pool of as many researchers as possible on both sides, AI and SDGs. So that's why IRCAI is trying to create a global network of AI excellence centers, right? So these are not necessarily machine learning centers. These can be machine learning, broad AI, but also obviously sustainable development research groups and centers that would kind of bring in this mishmash. Because we cannot solve it all. It's just impossible, even if we would want to. So IRCAI is about alliances. Let me just drop you a very short link to the website and to exactly what I'm discussing, just for your information. And having said that, what Matej and Matej again will be showing are two pieces of software that, or should I say data science, would basically kind of give you a glimpse of what is it that we're currently doing in terms of literally understanding how to address two interesting problems within sustainable development in our group. And I'll leave it at that. And Tatiana, I think you're the one to introduce Matej, right?
Matej, are you with us?
Which one? Usinkovic?
Usinkovic.
Yeah.
You have the floor. No, please, you're free to start your presentation.
Let me share my screen. Okay. Okay, so I'll try to briefly present NIADES. NIADES is a project founded by EU, and it aims to accelerate the digitization of water sector. Let me start first with the problem, just to get a brief understanding. So this is a map showing the water stress levels for Europe. And what we can see that the water stress level is very severe, mostly on the south, where the temperatures are high and water resources are scarce. And especially if we look at Spain and Italy, we see that those two countries have quite significant problem with Europe. And when looking at this graph, which shows actually the losses of water that's happened through the distribution to the end consumers, we see that the Spain and Italy are losing about 30 to 40% of all water they are distributing to the end users, so end consumers. So we see that there is a problem, which is not a problem that has happened since recently. This is an old problem. But what is happening within the water sector, and this is happening on a global scale, is that is being increasingly digitized. So by digitizing the water sector, the aim is to more efficiently tackle existing problems. And what is actually really important, and also one of the main reasons why NIADES was founded by EU, is that currently the water sector is in the opportunistic phase of adoption. So this is the middle phase in the typical adoption curve, and this is important because if the water sector wouldn't be in the opportunistic phase, for example, if it would be not started in basic, if you would develop a digital product for the water utilities, they simply wouldn't understand why the product is needed for. While if the phase of adoption would be in systematic or transformational phase, it wouldn't make sense to develop a digital product because there would be just too many competitors. So we are in the phase which is kind of an ideal of developing digital products for water sector. And yeah, this is also one of the important reasons why the NIADES was founded. So what is the idea of NIADES? So the idea is very simple. Water utilities already understand that they need to start monitoring their resources, what is happening in their networks with everything. So many utilities have already installed a series of sensors, various sensors. However, they are aggregating this data, but they're not doing anything with the data. And the idea of NIADES is simply, okay, why wouldn't we build the NIADES cloud? Simply ask water utilities, okay, come with the data, plug them in, and giving them the services that are being developed in NIADES. So that's the basic idea. So plug the data in and play the services. Okay, a little bit more broad information about NIADES. So this is a consortium of 20 partners from all over Europe. It's led by itself from Greece. The project budget is about 5 million. It started in May 2019, and it's finishing, the project will end in 6 months. We have 3 pilots, the 3 cities: Alicante from Spain, Braila from Romania, and Cluj from Switzerland. So what are we developing? So what are the services I was describing before? So every city has different priorities. For Alicante, they have the need to have a very accurate consumption predictions, because they're transporting potable water from very far away, and they really need to have accurate predictions in order to better manage water resources. And of course, as they are coastal city, they would like to be more informed about the saline intrusion into their sewage network. For Braila, we are developing the leakage detection. So the leakage detection, it can be a spatial temporal leakage detection. So when we are talking about temporal analysis, we are simply dealing with the time series and trying to identify anomalies, trends, and everything that could get a better insight into what's happening with the water, and help Braila to act sooner than they actually would. And then we have a spatial analysis where we are trying at least to assess where the actual leakage within the water distribution network could be happening. And for Braila, we are the same as for Alicante, developing also water consumption prediction. For Cluj, we are having completely another use case. We are trying to optimize the public gardens watering. We are predicting when the public gardens needs to be watered, the amount of water. And on the other side, the other case for Cluj, we are dealing with the public fountains. As public fountains, they need to be clean. And we are trying to identify some contamination, predict contamination, and help the city of Cluj to actually react sooner than they actually would. Then we have 2 general services. One is the data-driven weather predictions, and the other is the water observatory. Now, most of this, so all of them, they are services the NIADES platform will be offering, except for the water observatory, which is a separate, let's say, website. And it's basically, we are trying to create an observatory in relation to water. We're trying to monitor water-related events in order to explore relevant water issues. Water Observatory is developed in line with the SDG 6 goals. And currently, you can explore water events through visual representations of local and global datasets, by exploring press and Twitter sphere, and through the exploration of Microsoft Academic Graph, which is one of the largest, if not the largest, database of papers, publications, etc. So the Water Observatory is already available. And thank you. That was my brief presentation of NIADES. Not sure if there are any questions.
Thank you, Matej, very much for presenting this interesting project on water management. So I would now like to invite Mateo Kovacic to take the floor. And I believe he will share some work on public procurement and government accountability projects related to AI. So, Matej, you have the floor.
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me and can you see my slides? Yeah, okay.
We can hear you very well and we can see your slides.
Okay, so I will briefly present the DBI for you project, which is about visualizing and analyzing public procurement data and also public payment data. It was an European project which is already finished and was run by a consortium of 10 partners from all over the Europe and was of course funded under European Union Horizon 2020 research program. So what is the aim of what was the aim of the research? So the idea was to make the procurement in Europe more accessible. So the problem is that a lot of data, similar as Matej said for water management, a lot of data about public procurement is published online, is being collected, but not much analysis has been done. So the idea is that we try to collect as much as data as possible. And since the data were published in different formats, of course, every country has some other website or providing data in some unique way. So we developed tools for normalizing tenders and awards data. And we have built knowledge graph, European procurement knowledge graph, where the data were stored in standardized format. And we finally published the data in the OCDS format. This is some standard format for publishing procurement and financial transactions data. And this data are available under the Creative Commons license. And on the top of that, we started to develop tools for analysis and visualization of collected data, and we also tested some business cases. So this is the platform described in a picture. What is more important is that the platform contains data. So knowledge graph and document repository, schemas, tools for harvesting data for ingestion, normalization, and so on, APIs and services and tools on the top of this data. So DBI for you knowledge graph. This is information from May 2021. Consistent a lot of information about tenders, awards, and companies. Of course, we included also some data about the companies. Here you can see the numbers, and is published as an open data under the Creative Commons license, and is available also through an API or as data dump. So our role here was to develop online toolkit for exploring public spending and tender data. And basically this platform, I will show you a couple of slides about this, is trying to detect anomalies in financial transactions and in public procurement. So for financial transactions, we have several methods. I will not describe them here in detail, but for instance, here is one graph, quite interesting. So financial transaction is defined as a base relation between two entities. So when public sector entity pays a bill to private business entity, this is a transaction. And we detect whether transactions has some anomaly. And here you can see anomalies. For instance, here was a political crisis, migrant crisis, and COVID and so on. So in that case, our anomaly detection tool has uncovered some anomalies which are culminating on some specific events. So if I go to the next example, here you can see with some other anomaly detection method that anomalies are detected at the end of the fiscal year. So here's what is here happening. At the end of the fiscal year, budget users need to use all the money, all the budget money, or if they don't use it, they need to return it to the central budget. So at the end of each year, Santa is coming, and they spend all the money they have left. And you can see here that there are some anomalies detected in their spending. Another part, so this was the first part, and another part was analysis of public procurement data in OCDS. So for financial transactions, we only had the data about Slovenia, from Slovenia. Unfortunately, not from other countries, but for public procurement data, we had data from many other countries. And also here, there are different methods used, and we have computed some synthetic common anomaly rank. And for each company, this anomaly rank was computed, and then you will able to, for instance, to look to the company and find out why how the anomaly is explained. So anomalies were explained in natural language, and in this case, company competition was compared to average competition and average competition within selected CPV. So for instance, here you can see that this company don't have a lot of competition. So when they apply for a tender, they're the only company who applies for the tender usually. And of course, there are several types of anomalies detected, for instance, dependence, share, and so on. And we have also implemented a method showing a visual representation of interdependence between tender value and number of employees of economic operator. And for instance, here you can see that this company, for instance, they have received 10.6 million euros from one tender, but they have just one employee. And is this something illegal? Well, we don't know. Maybe it is, maybe it's not, but it's something that is worth to take a look by regulatory organs. And that's what we are doing. So we are helping here regulatory organs and also, journalists and public to find out anomalies which maybe are, just normal anomalies, or they are, something suspicious or even illegal. And for instance, here's another example. Here's one small group which with high final tender value and low number of employees of economic operators, and this group stands out. So if you on the platform, if you click on this dot here, you will get the list of the companies and the tenders they have won, and you can see you can also see the text of the tender and all the relevant data, and you can do your research. So our platform is accessible at this address. I also have pasted the address to the chat, and also source code is available at GitHub. And I will conclude here, and we'll give the mic back to the.
Thank you very much, Matej. It was indeed a very interesting presentation. We have received a few questions from the floor, so perhaps we can start asking them to the speakers, including our speakers from Unesco, from the first presentation, Cedric and Pratik. You're also invited to answer the questions. I will start with Luciana Lima's question. She says that Cedric briefly mentioned the impact of AI in the cultural sector. And she would like to hear more of UNESCO's perspective on opportunities and challenges posed by AI for the protection and promotion of the diversity of cultural expressions. And also, if you could share main policy recommendations in this area. This is very in line with some of the work that we have been conducting in Cetic as well. We are conducting qualitative work on the impacts of AI in the diversity and the promotion of the and protection of the diversity of cultural expressions in Brazil. So we would love to hear more of UNESCO's perspective on this topic. So I'm not sure if Pratik or Cedric would like to address the question.
Well, I start us off and then Pratik will complement. Just to say also that neither Pratik nor I are working in the culture sector. So we know about, but we are not the specialists, and we're happy to connect you also with our colleagues in the culture sector. And I really recommend to colleagues, I mean, culture has a policy area in the recommendation to have a look at this. There are many interesting dimensions in this 28 pages long recommendation. But what it says is that member states are encouraged to incorporate AI systems where appropriate in the preservation, enrichment, understanding, promotion, management, and accessibility of tangible, documentary, and intangible cultural heritage. And I will try to be a little bit more concrete in just a few seconds how that could look like. And I think another interesting aspect in that is, of course, linked to the impact, to examining and addressing the impact, the cultural impact of AI systems, especially through NLP, so through natural language processing applications, such as automated translations, or the CC in your, it is just actually only trying to translate everything in Portuguese, probably, just if you look at it, Tatiana. But here, the recommendation again asks on the consequences of the use of these automated translations and voice assistants and so on the nuances of human languages and expressions. And so what are the negative, possible negative implications and so on? It also asks for trainings of artists and creative professionals and so on. But how could it really concretely look like? You could use AI to combat, for example, illicit trafficking of cultural objects and the destruction of cultural property. If you use automated object recognition and internet transactions analysis, you can fight illicit trafficking of cultural objects. And another way of doing some of the work of our cultural sector would be to use automated object descriptions of large collections of cultural objects, or to enhance visitor experiences in museums through virtual reality or artificial reality, or you could even, I mean, respecting privacy and so on, also you look at visitor behaviors in the museum and so on. There's also I shouldn't be speaking too long. I think I gave a few ideas, and I'm happy to link up with anybody who would like to know more in our cultural sector colleagues. But deep dive into the recommendation, it is really fascinating what is in there. Thank you.
Excellent. No, thank you very much. Perhaps another question is to UNESCO. Lucas says that you have mentioned this big gap in knowledge on AI across the world. And he wants to know if the perception on AI from governments and civil society, if this was a challenge during UNESCO's consultations. So he wants to hear a little bit of the perceptions of government and civil society in terms of AI. I wonder if you could mention a little bit about this, either Pratik or Cedric.
Pratik, I'll let you take this one.
Okay. So it's a really interesting question. So we follow the negotiations around the text of the recommendation, which is all public. Anyone can view it, or was live then. I don't know if it's still available. So different countries had different levels of preparedness. We had 193 member states And what I can say, not everyone was speaking as much for sure. So this is in general an issue around in diplomacy. There are actually institutes which train diplomats on these topics so that they can actually actively participate, because part of creating a common future for everyone also involves having capacities and trainings for people who are negotiating. So that, I think there is a different level of engagement depending on where you are from. I mean, I wouldn't go too much on commenting on that, but I would just add that we at UNESCO actually worked with UNDESA to develop a guidebook for diplomats, where we looked at AI policies around the world. We broke down what is AI ethics, what does it mean, and presented them the resources. Now, this is now available for all the diplomats who are negotiating, for instance, in New York, around the world as well, to go through and have the resources. So that is one thing that we concretely did here. In terms of the differences from civil society, some of the consultations that we did, we had this feedback that, yes, you want multi-stakeholder participation, but sometimes people are hesitant because they think that AI is something too technological. And we don't want to talk about it because you're coming with terms, machine learning, deep learning, and we just feel uncomfortable. It's not a welcoming space. So how to address that as a challenge as well. So this is part of what we are trying to do with some of these, basic trainings on AI and human rights, the micro learning course that I talked about before, or the AI comic strip that we're talking about, so that the discussions and the conversations become more accessible. Yeah, I'll stop here.
Thank you. No, that was excellent. We still have more questions for UNESCO, but we also have questions for our colleagues at IRCAI. So perhaps I can switch to our colleagues at IRCAI, and then we can come back to UNESCO for more questions. So these questions this question is from Paulo Custard. He wants to know, he says, excellent presentation. And he says, thinking both from the point of view of data sets that represents the local culture and opportunities for using AI, how can organizations, and especially in developing countries, could be favored by this revolution? Thinking that in many places, you can have to think about phases of structuring, measuring, analyzing data, and an ecosystem that provides feedback to public policies. How can we take this leap? How can we take advantage of this revolution to reduce inequalities? Are there shortcuts that can be thought of?
I mean, if I can pitch in, probably there are not. Shortcuts are very rare. But in our experience, what works is small pilot projects that could potentially showcase the potential if something bigger would be implemented. That would be the long story short, I think.
Matei, any of the Mateis would like to add something to this answer?
Yeah, thank you. I think this really depends on the case, on the AI, the usage of AI. And it can be generalized, but for example, I will give an example here for NIADS. We are making this digitization of water sector, and you have to have a functional water utility and function. So, for example, imagine a city having a water distribution network with lots of leakages. Then for example, our solution would be questionable in this case. You have to have, or at least you would need to approach it differently. So it's really, AI is not, for example, it's a very nice example how AI, it's not a general solution to any problem, but you always have to approach, you have a problem and you have to approach it and solve that specific problem.
Thank you, Matei. We have another question to IRCAI researchers. Fabio Storino, also from Cetic, he says, excellent work. Do you gather data only from national governments or subnational governments as well? Do governments provide machine readable data, or do you have to scrap and transform the data first? I believe this is in reference to the last presentation.
Yeah. In short, we gather data also from local communities, for instance, from Spain, Zaragoza. For instance, if I answer also the previous question, for instance, for Slovenia were publishing data on some portal, but not in machine readable form. So our partner, the project was Slovenian Ministry of Public Administration, and they were really open. And I think the cooperation with local domain experts and local communities is very important. So you need to go to listen to them, what are their needs, and then try to solve the problem with their understanding of the domain, of the community, and so on. And the other thing is, of course, some governments cooperate more, some less. Some publish the data in OCDS format, some don't. So basically, you need to develop unique data importer for every data source. That was, very a lot of effort was put into that to get the data in some normalized and
We've lost
I
Matej.
think there's a problem with it. Yeah, I think we lost Matej. We had a problem with his connection. He's back. Matej, can you hear us?
Yeah, sorry, I have lost internet connection for a while. So I don't know if have you heard me or not?
No, we did. We just lost, I think, the final minute of your answer, but we were able to grasp it.
So I was saying that Ministry of Public Administration was a Slovenian Ministry of Public Administration was a partner at the project, and they were really open. And I think that cooperation with local domain experts and community is very important. Whether the governments provide machine readable data or not, it depends. Some governments cooperate more, some less, but usually you need to develop unique data importer for every data source. So getting the data in one central database and normalizing them in one format, this was really a lot of effort was put into that, and this was probably the hardest part of the project.
Thank you. No, I can imagine engaging different stakeholders on these projects on AI is always a very big challenge. So thank you for sharing these insights with us. We have a few minutes left and we have two questions. I will try to ask them both and then give the floor to Unesco because they're both directed at Unesco. José Antônio Gouveia Galhardo, he wants to know, he asks Unesco, he says, thank you for great presentations. And he says, much of the developments of ICT were born in the military area. And with AI, this is no different, he says. So he asks, is it possible to believe in a good AI regulatory and development framework, given the dispute for the leadership in the military application of this technology? And he also asks how to deal with this military black box. So I would like to throw this very big question to Unesco and also ask a second question, which is related to education. We only have a few minutes, but Silvia Guimarães Medeiros, she wants to know how Unesco sees the impact of AI in education in terms of the elementary, middle, and high school students. And she says, are we under the risk that with extensive and intensive use of apps offered by big educational players, we are having a pasteurized education worldwide, or perhaps in the West and East? So these two very simple questions for our colleagues at UNESCO. We have 2 minutes or so before the break. You have the floor.
Okay, well, I mean, the first one is really easy because we have in the UN different bodies and it's very clear, and our member states were very clear, we should do nothing relating to the military, to automated weapons and so on. You will not find a word on that also on our human rights-based ethical AI recommendation. On the second one, I think we do I don't see a unified. One needs to look at what does AI really do. It does three things. So one is improving learning outcomes, and it can do that through personalization, through improved learning and assessment. And there, if you have improved learning and assessment and personalization, it is and it works well. It would not be then the globalized learning and standardization thing. And the second one is, of course. I mean, we do speak and look at also data analytics and educational management and information systems, EMIS, and there it is also actually, you could find out today there are a number of good students coming out of that school. Why is it? And you could find out it's not because the school is good, because actually all these teachers went through this teacher education institution and so on. So you can learn a lot and improve and individualize learning there. So all this is about improving learning outcomes. There is also the second dimension about preparing learners for an AI-driven world, and it is about new curricula for an AI-powered world. We could speak about more developing AI capacities through a number of things, but that would be my response. I don't know if my colleague Pratik would like to add anything there.
I think I'll just add something on the black box. So there is a lot of research going on explainable AI and how to ensure that the decisions being taken by algorithms can be understood by people, so that there's more accountability. We also talk a little bit more about transparency and AI in our publication, which I'll put in chat. So voila.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Cedric and Pratik, and to all speakers. In fact, we have reached our time limit for this first session, so I would like to really thank all of you for kindly sharing with us some of your very interesting work that you have been conducting in your organizations. We would love to have more time to hear, but we will certainly continue following the development of your projects, so please keep us up to date. And we will now break for 5 minutes and then return shortly to our second round of presentations on a project. So please stay with us. Thank you very much and see you soon.
Thank you so much.
Recording in progress.
And we are back for our second session. So to continue this discussion, this debate on the AI projects that have been conducted by different organizations, I would now like to invite our next speakers, which are representing the Center for the Fourth Industrial Revolution, C4IR Brazil, which is an organization that is affiliated to the World Economic Forum. So I'm pleased to invite Lucas Câmara, the Executive Director of C4IR Brazil, Clara Langevin, who is AI and Machine Learning Platform Manager of C4IR Brazil, and also Rafael Fácio, who is Government Fellow of the organization. So Lucas and colleagues, please share with us what C4IR has been doing to promote a better use of AI. Thank you very much for being here today with us, and you have the floor for 25 minutes.
Thank you, Tatiana. And first of all, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to our international audience. It's a pleasure to be here. I would like to extend my greetings to Alexandria, all the Cetic members and professionals. Thank you again for the invitation. And let me start by just quickly introducing C4IR. Big name, the Center for the Fourth Industrial Revolution, but pretty much the World Economic Forum, it's known for the Davos meeting in January, but it's a couple of years now, decades, that the World Economic Forum is more than an event, and it's one of the leading international organizations for public-private partnership. And the C4IR is an initiative of the World Economic Forum to be a hub for global multi-stakeholder cooperation to accelerate the benefits of science and technology for the people, right? And we work with governments, with universities, with businesses, and civil society to develop, to prototype and test pioneering collaborations and governance models to help address practical challenges of this technology. It's important to highlight that the fourth industrial revolution technologies are being used as the baseline to reinvent the way we operate everything, and from government services to education and healthcare, the way business interacts and provide value to their customers. But however, those technologies that we have been listening previously here today, that these technologies have potential to exacerbate inequality, to do harm. So human-centric inclusion and trust must be the guiding principle for action in order to avoid power abuse, bias, wealth disparities, exclusion, and the loss of livelihoods that they also and bring about. So, but also the fourth industrial revolution can play a critical role in the adoption of stakeholder capitalism and the ESG approach. So we can have be part of the solution as well. So here in C4IR, we try to do that. And we try to engage proactively, bring to the table other organizations, especially for communities that are not necessarily very much engaged in those discussions. Only big companies, big governments that are addressing, but we see their vision very important to go by those principles I just mentioned. I'll ask everyone to access our website. You go to your browser and put it WEF and then C4IR. You're gonna see. I'm gonna put on the link here some of our projects so you guys can read a little bit more about it. But we have someone asked previously about AI for children. We have a project regarding that AI generation, on how AI-powered toys can be very challenging to parents, teachers, and to society as a whole, and how to tackle this. So it's with UNICEF and legal foundations, very interesting work. We have also we have been working with Norway to open data of the ocean, right? We are in the decade of the oceans in the UN. So it's huge amount of things that we can accomplish cooperating in data for ocean. That's another initiative that I would recommend you guys to go through it. And we have in general like a more global action coalition for AI to address several issues. We have one to data as well. So I'll share those links. I'll stop here. And before I hand to my colleagues, so we can share a little bit of one of our projects, I'll tackle. I'll share with you some thoughts on our project we have been doing here in Brazil for healthcare. We are still prototyping, trying to see how we tackle the issue. But for those of you who are not from Brazil, let me just quickly say that the Brazilian healthcare system is based on the English one. So we give free universal healthcare to all the population. And around 70% of the Brazilians go to the public hospitals. And we have a very decentralized model in which the federal gives funding and policy, a state level gives complex interventions for hospitals, and the fees give primary care. So our project tries to bridge those systems. As you can imagine, each and every one of the Brazilian cities and states have different IT systems and different way of using them. So we are discussing very strategic issues here when it comes to AI, but I would like to take a step back and sometimes say we have a very basic problems, and how do we collect data? How do we use data? And how do we help institutions and organizations adopt common standards? That's very challenging, and we have been seeing a lot of silos and organizations that are not willing to engage in exchanging those information. Information technology teams are left alone to deal with that, and that's no way they're gonna address the issue by themselves. They need to be tandem with the healthcare professionals to address those issues. But our main objective here is to get the data of the patient that suffers from non-communicable diseases, so hypertension, diabetes. This is the majority of the taxpayer expenditures in healthcare here in Brazil and globally as well. But this data is not available to the medical to the healthcare professionals when the patient comes to them. It gets stuck in the process, and so we are prototyping a protocol to share this data using the already available infrastructure, but that the participants do not use. They do not, especially because, and this is one thing that I would like to highlight, the commercial conflicts of interest when we come to standards of data and how to share it. We have political complexities, geopolitical complexities, but this is most of the time this is a procurement process. A private sector company comes in and develop a system that is not fit to exchange to others. So just reverberating a little bit of the discussions we just had previously in the panel. So yes, we are facing that. But also one of the key issues that we're already seeing in this project is the importance of changing the funding process. From today is pretty much based on the the care itself, person. But now we are seeing a change in which we are changing the funding model in a way that we can better input the data and share the data. This is paramount in order to increase the amount of input in the system and the ability of sharing. I will stop here for time's sake, and of course, I'm happy to further discuss with you guys. And but just handing the floor to my colleagues Clara and Rafael, but saying that this is very important that we promote interoperability and standards. Otherwise, we won't be able to measure success, and eventually we're gonna be left out with the huge amount of data that we are, but not making the best use of it, especially in AI systems. But now to you, friends, and then back to discuss with you.
Well, thank you very much, Lucas, for this brief and short introduction about the goal and the objectives in the C4IR network. Only to present myself really quickly here. My name is Rafael. I'm a member of the Office of the Attorney Generals here in Sao Paulo. I was previously the lead counsel for public procurement for 3 years. So I was really happy to see the previous presentation for our friends in Slovenia. And now I'm currently the lead counsel for intellectual property, science, technology, innovation. I was also a consultant for the Inter-American Development Bank in open innovation and public procurement for innovation here in Brazil. We developed a toolkit and a framework for this. So there's no wonder that when I was seconded by the state of Sao Paulo to the World Economic Forum, I was chosen to engage and lead AI procurement in a box, which is a project directly towards bridging this gap between using procurement as a tool, and a very powerful one, to foster development of human-centered AI. So we are going to talk about specifically this AI procurement project, and you have 4 assumptions in which it is based. First of all, we came through a wide number of a wide array of arguments here in this presentation today that shows that AI has become and is becoming increasingly complex. Even specialists have a hard time to understand fully how deep learning systems work. And as Lucas marvelously stated before me, we have many unintentional or intentional negative consequences arising from AI systems and uses. So when we have this, and the worst thing that can happen to any technology and to regulation of technologies in general is to fall in distrust. It's very important not to let AI, for example, to fall in distrust because of those negative intentions and there's negative consequences that it has. And we have a wide array of literature showing that we might not get the necessary or the correct incentives arising spontaneously from the market in order to have this human-centered and ethical concerned AI developed from the market. So we come as to a very old tool with a wide array of evidences supporting the use of the purchasing power of the state to support and to foster development of innovation. We have 13.5%, that's the recent data of GDP in Brazil, the public market. In the Oecd, we have an average from 10 to 15%. I recently gave a lecture to the Ministry of Finances in Angola. I took at their numbers, they are like 25, 35% of GDP and the public purse, for example, in 2016, if I'm not mistaken. So in any scenario, that's a huge amount of money. And we have strong evidences supporting literature that see, in, for example, innovation policy literature, that the purchasing power of the state can be a powerful tool to develop AI. We do not have clear evidences of this in AI and in human-centered AI, but I believe that we're moving towards this. And when we talk about putting procurement and AI in the same room, I wouldn't say that they get along really well. Procurement asks for auditable, a safe environment. We're very concerned here with value for money, and we're deeply concerned as well in preventing corruption and collusion. This auditable environment is not like the best place to develop uncertain and highly collaborative innovation, such as, for example, with artificial intelligence. And we have, for example, in Brazilian law, a wide array of instruments that come in the intersection between research and development efforts and information technology. We come from, for example, supply-oriented instruments to develop researches or deep researches in AI, to, for example, the use of open domain dynamic auctions, if we're talking about incremental innovation and really, simple AI systems. So we're not going to dwell in each of these procedures and types of procedures, but the point is that the World Economic Forum, in this specific project in which we are currently working on, has put together a wide number of recommendations and best practices from all around the world in order to best acquire AI systems, incorporated into the acquisition process, all this human-centered and ethical approach. We are currently developing a specific toolkit for Brazil, and we already have 2 pilots, one in the Metrô de São Paulo, the state-owned company that runs the subway system here in São Paulo, and Hospital das Clínicas, which is the largest hospital in the Southern Hemisphere. So we're really excited to see the ongoing developments of these pilots. Clara is going to talk about this a bit later, but we are doing this in collaboration, and this is a very important part of the forum's methodology. We are deeply engaged with the multi-stakeholder approach. So we have 3 project communities. We're not only engaged with our pilots, but we also have a very wide expert network. Some of the organizations here in the Cetic event are represented in this expert network as well, and are helping us to better define, co-create, and validate some of the assumptions that we have to develop this specific toolkit, this AI procurement toolkit for Brazil. And any toolkit, I do not know any single toolkit in the world who has succeeded without a vivid community of practice to put all those recommendations after we have a published draft into practice. And this is very important as well. So only to end here and stop to give Clara the floor, I would like to say that we have already 32 members in C4R experts community, which are really helping us to see if we are or not on the right track. We have already finalized the first draft of the main chapter in this, and we aim to have a final draft by December. So we are really glad and proud of the upcomings of this specific procurement project in Brazil. And now I'm handing the floor to Clara, my colleague in C4R Brazil, to give some updates about the pilots and some other aspects on the future developments of AI procurement in the box globally. So Clara.
Thank you, Rafael. Just introduce myself briefly. I'm Clara. I am the platform lead for artificial intelligence and machine learning at C4R Brazil. So I'm going to first talk about our pilots. As anybody who is familiar with the C4R network's methodology, one of the principal points is to pilot out through practical cases some of the policy recommendations that are within our white papers and toolkits. So this project, as Rafael mentioned, was before piloted in the UK, in India, and in Bahrain, I believe the city of Dubai. And now we're trying to pilot both the original framework and also some issues that we think are particular to Brazil within our 2 pilots. The first is the Metrô de São Paulo, and the second is the clinical hospital of the University of Sao Paulo. So the first pilot that we have is Sao Paulo's predictive maintenance systems for their tracks. Basically, they want to buy a system that allows them to know if something's going wrong in many, I think they have over 100 kilometers of track. So what they're currently doing in this project is they're trying to explore how exactly they want to use the current Brazilian procurement systems to buy something that is innovative. So one of the reasons why we got this to be our pilot is to see exactly how we can match their procurement system and the Brazilian more formalistic procurement system to some of the ideas that were already brought up by the World Economic Forum. So one of the things that they decided to do was Encomenda Tecnológica, which is an innovation-based procurement process, which allows for the evaluation of risk. So there's a risk matrix that tries to understand whether or not this project is an innovation and has not been implemented in Brazil before. So some of the things that we're doing to make sure that this is a human-centered approach and that it's using the recommendations of the World Economic Forum is putting in an algorithmic impact evaluation within their risk matrix. So for those of you who aren't familiar, an algorithmic impact evaluation is a risk evaluation that was first created by Canada's Directive on Automatic Decision Making, and now has been used in a lot of other procurement and public sector AI-related projects ever since. It basically looks at the context and the data and the systems surrounding an AI or automatic decision-making project, and tries to see if there are different levels of risk or if there are things that need to be mitigated before the project comes to fruition. So basically with this project, we're trying to see if we can incorporate these ideas into the traditional Brazilian procurement process. And then for our next project, next slide, the Sao Paulo Hospital, the Sao Paulo Clinical Hospital, they have an idea of creating a marketplace for AI tools to be used both inside of their hospital and with other hospitals and healthcare systems in the area. So here they're looking at validating different algorithms, training them using Brazilian healthcare data, knowing that many of these algorithms might come from abroad and might need to be retrained using contextual data in order to be used efficiently and effectively in Brazil. But this is a project that's a little bit more down the line. What we're looking at with this pilot is the steps that they've taken to prepare for this major undertaking of artificial intelligence, most particularly how they're organizing their data structures. So this hospital, it's a huge research hospital. I think it has over 10 different departments, and each department has their own data sources. So we're looking at how they're going to integrate all of these different data sources and how they're going to take the appropriate measures to anonymize all this very private healthcare data in order to use it in artificial intelligence systems. So this is important because it will lower developing costs and facilitate access to algorithms, looking specifically at some of the other hospitals that are within the Hospital das Clínicas communities in small towns or even within the city of Sao Paulo, and will help solve infrastructure gaps and guarantee quality, especially the responsible use of artificial intelligence within the system. So my next slide, we've been, in order to understand exactly what we need to contextualize within this system, we've been doing a benchmarking study of a bunch of different organizations in Brazil, so that have already adopted AI. Basically, we're building upon some work that has already been done by Brazilian civil society looking at the use of AI in the public sector, but we're looking specifically on how they have organized their own data, their own databases, and how they have contracted artificial intelligence, looking specifically if they buy it from third sector parties or if they are looking at in-house developments and perhaps creating partnerships with universities. And what we found is that the later is more used. So most companies or most governments are using in-house developments. And then the next slide, which I believe is our last. So this is a literature review that we had. We've looked at 44 AI tools that have already been mapped by Transparency Brazil, looking at the specific kinds of artificial intelligence that's already in use in the Brazilian system. And I'll put this link of Transparency Brazil's document so that you guys can take a look at it later. And then now our next slide, just wrapping up our findings. We found that the majority of Brazilian systems so far prepared to are creating or developing this stuff in-house. And so we're looking at why exactly and why they are insecure about buying it from third sector entities. And then we've looked at some of the specific ethical risks in the Brazilian public sector. So looking at algorithmic bias, access to services, AI could increase this gap between the haves and the haves not. And of course, the transparency of both the procurement and implementation process, which is extremely important for AI. The integration for government departments is extremely important, and that's something that's going to be explored with our pilot with the Hospital das Clínicas. And then secondly, data quality, which is something that has been difficult for many different Brazilian organizations in adopting artificial intelligence. And we've been looking at some of the ways that developers and public sector entities have prepared themselves to adopt artificial intelligence. And that is it for us. I believe we're out of time, but thank you so much for letting us speak today. And I'll put some of our documents in the chat, and please reach out to us if you'd like to know more.
Thank you, Clara. Thank you, Rafael and Lucas. Thank all three of you for a very informative presentation. I'm sure there will be many follow-up questions. Let me remind all participants that we are still collecting questions from the floor. And in the meantime, we will briefly move to our second presentation in the interest of time. And then speakers from this first presentation will also be invited to address all of the questions in the question and answer session. So I would now like to welcome our last speaker of the day. Alistair Nolan is a senior policy analyst in the OECD's Directorate for Science, Technology and Innovation. Alistair, it's great to have you with us today. Thank you so much for your presence and for your contribution to our discussion. We know that the OECD have been conducting important work on AI, and we look forward to learn more of what you have been doing. So let me begin quickly by asking, why is AI relevant and how much do we actually know about the adoption of AI? You have the floor for 25 minutes, Alistair. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me clearly?
Yes, we can hear you perfectly.
Okay, very good. I think Lucas is going to put up my slides and move them on.
Yes.
So firstly, I'd like to thank Alessandra and Cetic and all the organizers of this event for inviting the OECD. I think it's a very useful gathering. So I'm going to spend my time saying a few words about some recent and forthcoming OECD work and the measurement issues around AI business and the diffusion of AI in business. Next, please. Now, clearly, the OECD member government and non-member governments give a great deal of an increasing degree of importance to AI overall, for all of the kinds of reasons that we've heard so far. It's a general purpose technology which will increasingly impinge on all of our lives. So here are the flags of 56 national and supranational AI initiatives as of 2021, which you can find on the OECD AI Policy Observatory. Next, please. Now, why does AI in production matter specifically? Next, please. There's two reasons which you can point to. One is the fact that OECD countries face a productivity crisis. That's to say that the rate of growth in the value of every hour worked has been stagnant for a number of decades. And you can look at that growth rate, which is indicated by the red bar, which represents the time period 2014-2017, and see how low it is relative to previous time periods. So our living standards ultimately depend on rising labor productivity, and AI must be part of the story in regaining the kind of productivity growth that we had in the past. Next, please. The need to, forward again, please. Thank you. The need to increase labor productivity is made all the more urgent because our populations are rising, becoming older very rapidly. So the old age dependency ratio, the ratio between those who are out of work, who are not economically active, and those who are of a working age, that ratio will more or less double in the next 35 years. So those, not only do we have to recover to previous levels of productivity, but we have to become all the more productive so that that diminishing share of the population which is in work can pay for the share of the population which is not economically active. Next, please. So why is productivity growth stagnant in this world where we hear all the time that there are these new productivity enhancing technologies with us? Next, please. And one of the main contentions among academics and analysts looking at this topic refer to the slow pace of technology diffusion. In this case, the slow pace of the diffusion of AI in the corporate sector. Next, please. Now, how do we know what's going on with respect to diffusion of AI, what the big picture is? Well, there's more or less three principal types of evidence. These are large-scale surveys gathered by national statistics organizations and other national agencies and supranational bodies like Eurostat. And these agencies usually embed AI modules in established surveys of ICT use, ICT expenditure, R&D expenditure, and so forth. We have a number of surveys done by management consultancies, blue chips like BCG, McKinsey, Price, PricewaterhouseCoopers, and then work done by NGOs, academia, and various foundations. Now, all of these different evidence sources have their own strengths and weaknesses. Clearly, the work done by national agencies have large sample sizes, but their AI modules are often quite shallow. They're not asking many questions which are particularly policy relevant. The work done by the management consultancies, for example, are often dealing with respondents who are part of their client base who are already ICT intensive firms, and sometimes the methodologies used are quite opaque. But if we look at some of the results of the large-scale surveys of AI done by these national statistics offices, you see the almost ubiquitous story is that the rates of uptake are low. If you look at South Korea, across the board amongst large firms and SMEs, it's estimated that only about 2% of all firms are using AI in some form. Now, there's not uniformity in the findings for various reasons which we might discuss, but even at its highest, Japan is 14% of firms. All of these readings are much lower than the sort of levels which one might expect given a cursory reading of the popular media or the general business literature. Next slide, please. You even find that the diffusion challenge is acute amongst even large firms that have no problem in accessing the resources required for adoption. So, for example, a survey done in the US of large manufacturers, these are firms with annual turnovers of between $500 million to $10 billion a year. This was done at the end of 2019, and this survey showed that only 5% of those 60 firms had mapped out where AI opportunities lie within their company, and 56% had no plans to do so. Next, please. But the problem of uneven and often low levels of diffusion is in fact common to many digital technologies, not just AI. And here we see that illustrated in the case of cloud computing, where you can see huge differences across countries. You might have Germany, where something like 10%, a little bit more of firms are using cloud, right through to at the upper end on the left of the graphic here, Finland, where something like 70% of firms, a bit less, just under 60% of firms are using cloud. Now, cloud is a technology which should level the playing field between small and large firms in terms of their access to computation. And yet you see again from this graphic, in almost every country, there's a big difference in the rate of use of cloud between smaller and larger firms. The rate in the large firms is indicated by the balloon at the top of the thin line. And we see successively the rates indicated by all other class sizes. So it's the large firms who use these technologies predominantly. And we see this in many other fields, even extending to agriculture, for example, where it's large farms which tend to use the more data-intensive forms of precision agriculture. Next, please. There's also an interesting issue to do with diffusion, and that's what diffusion at the subnational level, the effects and the rates of diffusion in lagging regions as compared to cities and dynamic metropolitan areas. One fascinating sort of stylized fact in recent years has been that we see an increasing disparity in productivity growth between poorer regions and richer regions. And one of the contentions is that advanced digital technology tends to amplify the productivity yield coming from existing endowments. So if you have good skills and good infrastructure, then the new technologies mean that you're going to benefit in a disproportionately positive way relative to more lagging regions. Next, please. And AI, if that story is true, AI is likely to exacerbate these dispersions in productivity outcomes because in part skills are so scarce and the skills are very mobile. We see work done in Europe by Fraunhofer showing that, for example, firms which are intensive in their use of robotics are much less likely to locate their FDI, to locate their production facilities abroad than otherwise similar firms. So the locational issue is an important aspect of diffusion. Next, please. So let's talk about then at the level of manufacturing, some of the nature of the specific challenge around diffusion. Next, please. So manufacturing, one characteristic of AI has been alluded to by some of the previous speakers, is that it's not really a plug and play technology. Next, please. AI would require the firm, next please, to engage in very often, and this varies by sector, a series of ancillary or complementary investments. So for example, data in firms tends to be stored in silos whereby, for example, data on supply chains might be held elsewhere separately from data on clients, on customers, and you might need investments in hardware to link these data repositories, and also a whole range of investments such that machines with different vintages using different operating systems can talk to each other in a seamless way. Next, please. Another challenge is that AI modeling it's like a combination of an art, a science, and software engineering all at the same time, which means that, and as I'll come to in a moment, you actually need multidisciplinary skills to incorporate it effectively. Next, please. Industry is also different from, say, for example, retail in terms of the level of accuracy required of AI systems. So, for example, if AI makes a small error in a marketing program, say for an online retail outlet, that will not have the same consequences as an AI making a similarly small error in many industrial processes where, for example, manufacturing is being performed often at molecular scale. And next, please. On the ROI, the return on investment. A key issue here is that practitioners tell us how hard it is to know the return on investment a priori of most AI projects, in part because many of these projects involve a degree of experimentation. There are complexities involved and an art, as I say, involved in modeling and data curation. Small firms, as a generalization, are less able to bear the risk associated with an uncertain return on investment. So one thing that policy can do actually is to help clarification of the ROI. So investing in AI is not like investing in virtual servers to replace physical servers, where it's much more evident what the return on investment is. And this sort of concern around the ambiguity on the ROI, this is borne out by some large survey work. For example, there was a piece done by the website content evaluator Market News a couple of years ago that showed that 69% of IT and corporate business leaders want more information about how to measure the return on investment. Next, please. Firms also face challenges in understanding how to build an in-house team, how to identify and attract the right and best talent, how long before these talented individuals will start producing results. So, for example, AI is used as an umbrella term for a variety of disciplines, including machine learning, image recognition, natural language processing, and so on. And each of these areas requires a significant level of mathematical skill combined with industry experience. So it's typically 10 years or more before someone is ready to really spearhead AI projects at the industry level. And there's a challenge in retaining specialists. So I had the luck not long ago to meet with the head of R&D at Michelin in Europe. They have 4,000 people engaged in R&D, and I asked him what his principal human resources problem was, and he said that it's to give people interesting work, that the era of control is over, and that very often talented youngsters want to be given projects that have frequently some R&D element or the novel in some way. And in many industrial uses, this is unlikely to be the case. Next, please. So let me just refer briefly then to some new survey work that we have in the pipeline. This is a collaborative effort between OECD, the Boston Consulting Group, and INSEAD Business School, which is trying to sit between some of the gaps in the different measurement approaches, which I outlined earlier. And Alexander and his team at NIC.br are giving us a great deal of help in the conceptualization of our survey instrument. Next, please. But the objective of the survey is to generate a variety of new cross-country data and policy analyses on the diffusion and use of AI, and doing so in a way that adds to existing survey evidence. Those that's helpful to policymakers, is new, complements existing evidence, and if possible, gives us results which are actionable in some way. Next, please. Actionable, for example, because all OECD countries and many non-OECD countries operate a broad range of institutions that have accelerated diffusion as part of their fundamental remit. And so we'd like, amongst other things, to see how these institutions are tailoring their services to meet the specific challenges of adoption that I've just outlined, and what firms themselves would require from such institutions. Are these institutions fit for purpose in a world where AI is ever more important? Next, please. So some of the possible survey components would be to ask questions which have not really been broached in other survey work or very little survey work. So have, for example, firms which use AI heavily, do they engage in public tenders related to AI? It's going back to the presentation we just heard a moment ago. Do firms use any public service, for example, for advice, information, finance, capacity building during the adoption process? Next, please. Is the potential of AI well understood in firms, including the use of AI in training? Next, please. Do firms consider that public agencies could assist the adoption process? And are there any priorities which firms flag? We know that from many surveys that recruiting the right staff is problematic, but what's the role, for example, of qualification frameworks in indicating to employers the veracity, the accuracy of the skills that people have in this domain? Are the existing qualification frameworks in some way misleading? Next, please. And do firms have high, no, or low awareness of national AI strategies? Next, please. And we're going to marry this survey work with a series of case studies on AI diffusion where we talk with much larger enterprises. Next, please. As this workshop, next, please. As this workshop is about measurement, I want to talk for a moment about a novel approach that the OECD is pioneering, is spearheading with the United States National Academy of Sciences, which has to do with measuring the scale of the skills-related challenge, which affects diffusion, but also affects the impacts of AI more broadly. Next, please. So, there've been a rash of books, of course. I'm sure everybody is familiar with many of them. A rash of books which kind of proclaim rather dramatically the end of work or a significant shock to the labor force, which will be brought about as a consequence of AI. Next, please. And you may be familiar in particular with this paper, the title here, written by two well-known Oxford academics. This gained a lot of traction a few years back, 2017, when the authors estimated that around 47% of total US employment is at high risk of being automated relatively soon, perhaps over the next couple of decades. Now, I'm not going to go into the methodological detail on how these numbers are estimated. We could come back to this at some point. But next, please. I want to go into explaining how in the same topic area, the OECD is doing some new work. And so I'll refer you to this publication. We can send a PDF to whoever is interested. This is a book which came out now 3 years ago, which is a first step in a much longer project with the National Academies of Science, which will be going on for, I think, for the next 7 or 8 years. And this book, and you'll see why when I explain what this does, this work in a moment. So this particular book is examining how AI could affect jobs and skills by looking at some objective measures that we have of the distribution of human proficiency and comparing those objective measures to what we will increasingly understand about the proficiencies, the capabilities, competencies of AI. And this book also describes some of the practical limitations affecting how education systems and what education systems really need to do to raise skills to the required levels. So next, please. So let me just tell you, I actually worked for a few years to help develop this survey of adult skills. This is called PIAC. People in the audience may be familiar with the OECD's PISA study, which I think Brazil also participates in. That measures the generic skills of 15-year-olds in a way which is neutral with respect to culture, curricula, and language. This is an equivalent piece of work, but for the the adult population of working age between 16 and 64 years of age. It measures 3 widely used generic skills: literacy, numeracy, and problem solving with computers, that is. And these are skills which about 75% of OECD workers use on a daily basis. And for that reason, they are the subject of huge investments in education to develop these skills. So this survey, which is a household survey, has allowed us to get these objective measures of these generic or foundation skills for a sample which is representative of 815 million adults across the developed world. So it's a colossal, unique database. Next, please. And PIAC, this survey, it grades the respondents' proficiency into 5 levels. And this is just for literacy. I'm not going to talk about what these 5 levels mean here. It will take too much time, and there is a technical definition for all of them. But let's just have a look at how the adult populations perform. So level 2 is the lowest, level 5 is the highest. So about 53% of the adult population in OECD countries perform at level 2 or below. About 35% perform at level 3, and only about 11% perform at the highest level, level 4 to 5. Next, please. So how does AI perform when we took a group of leading AI developers and tried to assess how the AIs would respond on exactly the same test questions which the humans took. And so we see that for literacy, AI can basically, in terms of literacy, do everything at level 2 and below. That's covering 53% of the population. It's close to be doing everything at level 3. That's another 35% of the population. So AI on literacy is close to being able to do everything which 88% of the adult population do. Now, AI can't perform at level 4 and 5, but only 11% of OECD adults can perform at that level. So next, please. Next, please. Thank you. So let's just think then. What does this mean? If literacy was the only skill that people used in their jobs, then AI would be displacing, but depending on the cost anyway of the AI would have the technical capability of displacing something like, well, the work that maybe 88% of the population do. But no job entails just a single skill like literacy. Even if you're a novelist, you don't use just literacy in your job. And there are a range of other important skills that people do in their work: expert skills, social skills, and physical skills, of course. But this OECD average of 11% of the population overall that performs at level 5, that can be raised when you look at if we could get more people into tertiary education, because about 20% of those with tertiary education perform at level 5 on PIAC. In Japan, about 37% of people with tertiary perform at level 5. So we might want to copy some of the procedures used by countries such as Japan if we're going to bring the population to a safer stage relative to the possible substitution from AI. But these improvements are very hard despite reform efforts across OECD countries for decades. Literacy in general across the population has actually declined since the 1990s. There's no example of a country getting most adults to level 4 or 5. So that's the scale of the challenge, one of the scales of the challenge. We're taking this work forward now, trying to add a new measurement framework which would look at the performance on physical skills of AI-enabled robots. We have metrics for the performance of robots in, for example, a pick rate, the extent to which robots can manipulate and grab, say, moving out from one place to another, random, unevenly shaped objects of different weights. So we're trying to look at possible frameworks for objective measurement on physical as well as cognitive skills. With that, I'll leave it there. Thank you. Really gratified to be invited to this event.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Alistair, for a great presentation and for sharing the terrific work that the OECD has been conducting on AI, especially in terms of measurement, which we know is not a simple task when it comes to AI. So thank you very much. And perhaps we can now open the floor for questions on the presentations delivered by C4IR Brazil and the OECD. So at this time, I can start off with the question that was asked for our colleagues at C4IR. Manuela Ribeiro, she says, thank you for the presentations. And she asks, in the case of AI used by Brazilian governments, how can subnational governments develop capacities in AI, especially in a context of disparities in access to financial, human, and technological resources among public organizations? Lucas, if you would like to begin, and perhaps.
Yeah, sure. Well, that's such a difficult question that I can start. Like, look, guys, amazing question, very, very interesting, but there's no easy answer to it. One thing that comes to my mind right now is, for example, the work that Sao Paulo have been doing with FAPESP, right? So what is what allows Sao Paulo to be probably, I don't know, I might be wrong on that, but leading these AI developments in Brazil, because there is 2% of our VAT, the value-added tax, that is reserved for science and technology. And so there is a streamline of investment and an ecosystem that is built around it. So I would argue that we should try to replicate that model in other subnational governments, in order to have more, as Alistair mentioned, I mean, we need to fail. We need to test and fail, and we need grants, and we need more resources and people getting that money to be here in Brazil and not leave to other countries that can, you know, pursue their challenging projects. So anyway, we participate, and I do believe many CGI also participate, but in the national AI strategy that we are trying to create what would look like the Brazilian strategy in practice, right? We have a document that sets out strategic guidelines, but now we are trying to find more concrete actions to make it happen. So we are open to suggestions, and then can bring to the federal government. But trying to address it, I would say that is a very important issue to, especially in the context that Brazil is facing right now with low investments to science and technology. I mean, we need to make it happen. Otherwise, we won't have AI widespread in our society. That would be my take for now.
Excellent, thank you. Let me ask if your colleagues, Rafael and Clara, would like to complement, or if not, we can move to the next questions. Yeah. So our next question, also for C4IR, Silvia Guimarães Medeiros, she says, it is concerning to observe that as we need more and more governance and policies regarding AI, we see a rise in autocratic nation states. How quickly should civil society be instructed on AI to prevent its overarching misuse? So she wants to ask about how we can engage civil society.
Very quick, I would say. We need to be very quick in highlighting to society as a whole these impacts. I'm very much concerned, and I think we have amazing efforts by several institutes. We just watched an amazing presentation from Alistair and an amazing work that the OECD is doing and we need to get it out. And what Cetic is doing right here, it's a way to do that, to share that information, and to put it available to everyone. I think we individually have that responsibility because we are engaged in this kind of a discussion. But the thing is, we tend to say it in a very complex wording, and we needed to make it more accessible to the general public. I think there is a sense of the threat and of the opportunities, but people get mixed messages about where are we heading and how we should tackle this. So yeah, I do agree. We have to make general public more aware, and we should do it very quickly. But I don't have the final answer to that any better than I had to the previous one. Sorry.
Not an easy question. We have one more question from Ana Laura. She wants to know, in your view, what would be the first and most important practical step to be taken in the direction of achieving an ethical use of AI?
I can take that question. And actually, I love that question because there's something that is very important and a no-brainer that a lot of people don't take into account, and is to make sure that your AI project, be it in the public sector or be it in the private sector or any other sector, academia or civil society, is that it's based on an actual problem. So you are conducting a project that is, you're trying to find a solution for a project, and AI is an option of a solution. And this is helpful for a practical implementation of AI ethics, because it makes you think about who is the audience of this project, who is going to benefit from this project. So what's the context that you need to think about when you evaluate ethical risks? And more importantly, how are you going to get the data necessary to have this project? So looking at specifically what kinds of data is important for a project to solve the actual problem. So I guess in a nutshell, the most important thing in an AI project is to look at the actual problem being solved, and then look at all the things around that project so that you have a holistic view of the context and not just specifically at the model of artificial intelligence.
Thank you, Clara. We have a few questions also for Alistair, so perhaps we can now move on to the next presenter, and if we have time, we can come back to the first presenters. So Alistair, Alexandre wants to know, he says, well, thank you for the excellent presentation. And he says, you have mentioned more than 50 or so countries having national strategies. And he asks, could you identify initiatives for measuring the impacts of AI? And if so, perhaps a follow-up question of mine would be, could you briefly mention the challenges perhaps in measuring the impacts of AI?
For measuring the impact, well, let me say one of the challenges when you think about using microdata. So some of the data which, if you can get large enough sample sizes, I think one of the big challenges is to really disentangle AI from other technologies which could be productivity enhancing. I mean, there's a gradient from use of statistics to big data to machine learning and so on. I mean, think in industry that forms of AI, these were early forms of AI, so-called expert systems. Forms of AI have been used in manufacturing for nearly 50 years. So firstly, it's like, what are we calling AI? But then I think it will be increasingly challenging. There are more groups that are trying to do this, and we try and do this at the OECD, but the microdata are of poor quality. Now we have a number of institutions which are trying to improve the availability of microdata. We work with many of those, including some national statistics offices. But just if I go back to the challenges again, one of the issues I think is that AI is increasingly ubiquitous within firms. So this might go right from the like trivial uses of AI in the sense that everybody has AI in their smartphone, for example, right through to the uses which are very niche uses in a particular production process, or using AI, say, in some of the most advanced applications for industrial design or managing supply chains like BMW is doing. But then even within the firm, even engineers who are using machinery, the chief technology officers, chief information officers, may not be fully aware of how much AI there is in the firm, because we start finding sensors, for example, buried deep within machines that are using AI to orchestrate, to monitor, and to channel efficient data flows. Even those who purchase the machines may not be fully aware of how AI is being used. So I think we'll have many measurement efforts around the world which are actually measuring different things with results which are not universally applicable. There will be big differences between sectors, for example. So I think it's a huge and very challenging measurement issue, which is, I think, more challenging than some of the previous rather discrete technologies, like, are you just using cloud, for example, and then look at the number of firms that are using cloud, and if you can track their productivity change over time, etc. So yeah, I think it's a big challenge.
Thank you, Alistair. Yes, we face this challenge also when we're trying to think of different approaches and ways to measure, either quantitative or qualitative, the impacts or even the diffusion of AI. So thank you very much for sharing your insights on that question. We have a second question also related to measurement. Winston wants to know how we can build up on existing skill indicator frameworks that measure literacy related to AI. We know that measurement in measuring literacy is also related to technology is also a challenge. So he would like to know how we can build up on the existing frameworks to advance in this front.
Yeah, I don't know of any specific frameworks which have been designed around AI. I'm unfamiliar with any. So, I mean, the literacy frameworks that we've been using in the PIAC survey, these are not AI specific, but they're looking at problem solving in a, in an online environment. But they wouldn't provide an accurate measure of how able somebody is to use machine learning, for example. So I've not seen any specific frameworks. I'd be delighted to be enlightened on that. And I just make one further caveat, is that we're using AI again as a very umbrella term, and that it's actually a whole series of subdisciplines. And this is important because when we go back to the question of the challenge of adoption in firms, friends of mine who are recent graduates point me to Reddit AI pages where the graduates are pointing out that the CEOs, the entrepreneurs, just actually didn't know what skills they really require in the graduates. And so because they don't understand all the distinctions between the different forms of AI, machine learning, and so on.
Excellent. Thank you, Alistair. No, we really appreciate all the efforts that the OECD has been conducting in terms of AI measurement, and we are happy to continue this discussion since this is indeed a challenge, and data producers and data users should come together to find feasible solutions to address this. So thank you. We have one last question, and this is addressed to the colleagues of C4IR. Paulo, he says, fantastic presentations. And he says, with regard to the use of AI in the public sector, one of the factors that stand out is the explanatory nature of the models. How can decision makers in the public sector internalize technologies that can support management without severely increasing the risks of use? And then a follow-up question would be, what are the critical factors for balancing choices between different solutions? who would like to take on this simple final question to close our...
I can take this one if you want to. I can start answering and maybe landing the floor to Clara. But maybe when you take a look at the AI specific literature, they always talk about the human in the loop as a way of reducing risk. However, this approach, and the World Economic Forum uses this recommendation as well. There are already strong evidences in recent papers from 2021, for example, stating that it has risks. For example, the automation bias, when you have like the human being over-reliant of the outputs of the algorithm, and also having this human in the loop to overcompensate non-distortions in the algorithm. So we should be taking a new approach towards this human in the loop in order to see if we can, have this decision support systems or even automated decision systems more, coordinated with the goals in public policy. But maybe, Clara, would you like to? I saw that you open your mic as well.
Oh, I think you're right on the spot. I think it's definitely how you have your own management system. If it is human in the loop, if it is some other ways of monitoring and evaluating your AI system, and especially what kinds of game plans or action plans you have if something goes awry. And especially when we're looking at explanatory models or models that support decision making, there's also a huge issue with bias, because you're usually processing a lot of different types of data. And then I think Pratik mentioned this in his presentation, you might have some sort of bias coming in by proxy or other mechanisms. So how exactly are you going to mitigate that? And what are you looking for when you're evaluating the use of artificial intelligence within your entity? These kinds of things, they happen. But again, what matters is how are you going to mitigate those, and what kinds of steps do you have already internalized within your organization?
I'll just jump in and say that we have amazing literature being made. I mean, works that international organizations are doing it. But I love a saying in English that when we translate to Portuguese has not the same impact. But there is no juggle without the struggle, right? Juggle like playing with those. So we need to test. We need to have courage and test different things in the public sector. I'm not sure if there is there's people from the government in the audience. We are very conservative in the Brazilian government. And we have some opportunities like regulatory sandboxes and different ways to approach those kind of things. And the only way forward is failing. And we need to accept that and start doing it more. And that institutional innovation that we need to address a little bit further in the country. I think there is no easy or like a more like a one size fits all solution to that problem. We need to test and iterate so we can get different perspectives, different obstacles, and then build our own solution to that challenge of balancing different complexities in AI projects.
Thank you, Lucas. Unfortunately, our time is up for today. It was great to have all of you with us. So I would like to thank all of the speakers for your excellent contributions to the sessions. And to all participants, also a very big thank you for staying with us through this third and final day and participating with very interesting questions as well. Very big thank you to all of us. And I would now like to give the floor to Alexandre for his closing remarks.
Thank you, Tatiana, for having moderating today's webinar in such a nice way. And on behalf of Cetic.br, NIC.br, and the National School of Statistical Science, I'd like to really thank all the speakers. It was a great pleasure and honor to have you with us today. And I would say that our presentations were really excellent. We have received a lot of feedback, not only in the chat, but also in my WhatsApp, many comments, parallel comments. So it was really very good presentations, very inspiring. And particularly, I would say, the real good examples and applications of AI we have seen in this panel today. So we have discussed about community. I guess it was Alistair mentioning the need of building community, AI community. I would say that your presentations today were a great contribution for raising awareness on the importance of measuring the impacts of AI in society as a whole, and equally important to build a data user community around this thematic of artificial intelligence. I don't know who was here in the first day, but Professor Maísa Magalhães, Principal Director of ENCE, she announced that Brazil is now hosting the UN Big Data Hub in Rio at ENCE. So the National School of Statistical Science at the Brazilian Institute for Geography and Statistics has signed this cooperation agreement. So it will be a good opportunity for us to have access to data sets and relevant big data sources for research, for policy making. So I encourage all of you to learn more about this Big Data Hub. And finally, I would say to all of you, please follow us at Cetic.br, www.cetic.br, for more information on our upcoming events. And with that, I close today's sessions and the 11th annual workshop on survey methodology. Thank you very much for having attended our workshop, and I hope to see you all again soon. Thank you very much. Bye.